Welcome to Season 8 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from around the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm taping the 100th episode of the show, and to mark this milestone, I am thrilled to introduce you to a very special guest. Paul Ehrlich is the Bing Professor Emeritus of Population Studies in the Department of Biology at Stanford and president of the university's Center for Conservation Biology. For more than half a century, Paul taught evolution, ecology, and human biology. His most famous book, The Population Bomb, has been called one of the most influential books of the 20th century. For all his work as an outspoken researcher and academic, Paul has earned countless international awards and honors, which you can read about on his Wikipedia page. And just like me, he's a self-proclaimed evangelist and propagandist. Welcome to the show, Paul.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so I just want to say, for the sake of the viewers and the listeners, that you played a major role in my life as I was working on my PhD, because your book, Humanity on a Tightrope: Thoughts on Empathy, Family, and Big Changes for a Viable Future, came out just the year before I defended. And on page 5, you and your co-author, Robert Ornstein, ask a question. I'm going to read it back to you and ask you to reflect back what your thoughts are 15 years later. So let me put on my glasses just so I read this properly.
Me too.
You wrote, "Why don't we register possible civilization-ending threats? The costs of not acting now to lessen the climate disruption could be extremely high, but we seem willing, even eager, to accept these costs rather than taking relatively inexpensive steps that would be beneficial even if climate wasn't changing. Why don't we have more empathy for the people who are already hungry and for the billions more who could well be hungry in a few decades? Why don't more people realize that if we don't pay increasing attention to our most inclusive family, the human family, the denouement for all will likely be horrific?" So what comes to mind when you hear those words read back to you?
The things haven't changed a bit. That's what comes to mind. We know what's happening. The scientific community has said many times what needs to be done. And for a whole variety of reasons, one of which is what we call the culture gap, it isn't being done. There's a lack of empathy. We can't put ourselves into the minds and situations of people who are not yet born. And we have to train ourselves to do that. But we even now are having a very hard time being empathetic for people who are already here.
Yeah. Okay, so your clarion call 15 years ago is louder than ever, more important, more urgent than ever. But first I want to go back in time. We're going to talk more about empathy, but I want to go back. You were born in 1932. And there were 2 billion people on the planet at that time. And then when your book, The Population Bomb, came out in 1968, there were roughly 3.5 billion. The expectation is by the end of next year, 2023, will be about 8 billion people. Now, you use the term human predicament to describe the situation that we're in. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that every analysis that has been done sensibly on what's going on in the world and what the future holds suggests that the maximum number of people, and this most recent one, by the way, what I'm quoting here is the work of Partha Dasgupta. Sir Partha Dasgupta is the world's best economist, and he just did a huge study for the British government on the economics of biodiversity loss, one of the things that's existential threats for our future. And Partha roughly calculated that if we did everything right, we might manage to sustainably support a population of 3.5 billion people at a little less than the Mexican standard of living. Now, when you look at a world coming up on 8 billion people, all of them wanting to have a Hollywood standard of living, you can see why I say all of my colleagues who look at the situation are extremely concerned about one of the major factors that is causing the world to end, the civilization to collapse, and that is there are too many people overall consuming much too much, and we're not doing anything about it, including, one of the things that has been suggested now for at least 30, 40 years that should be done about it is to give women everywhere the full rights or more than the full rights of what men get. And we know very well from history and analysis that when women have rights, they have fewer children, many fewer children, often. So there's one of the things that I think, and my colleagues all think, should be done just on a plain basis of equity. In other words, if nothing happened to their fertility because women had full rights, women still should have full rights, and we should take advantage of their brains and so on. And yet in the United States, the Republican Party has waged a full-scale war on women, which it's won. And the same thing is happening in other places in the world. In other words, we're going exactly in the wrong direction on one of the main variables. So I wish I could tell you something really cheery, but I've been terribly depressed by what's happened. And of course, going back a little bit to empathy, when you see what many young women, particularly those who are not well off financially, are facing individually in the United States, it can make you throw up. It is just disgusting.
So, as a scientist who, saw the canary in the coal mine, decades ago, and, all your conversations with your colleagues that are clamoring for the same kind of radical change that is required, how are you keeping any degree of optimism or hope alive? Like, you just mentioned that you're depressed. I really wonder, like, isn't it so terrifying to you?
I hate to be honest about it, but I will be honest about it. I don't think there's a chance in hell of solving the problem and giving my up to great grandchildren already a kind of life that I think would be wonderful for them. And when people ask me how I maintain my optimism, I don't have any optimism to maintain. They ask me why I keep writing and fighting and doing podcasts and so on this issue. And I think it's largely habit, and you feel you have to do something. In other words, if you don't want to be totally depressed, you got to hope that somehow the God will come out of the machine and somebody will make an invention that makes the Republican Party disappear, and we could really, because there would still, in my view, and I think that of the vast majority of my colleagues, if we would suddenly start to do everything right, to treat people right, to treat the environment right, to stop the vast consumption, to stop the idea that growth, of course, is the creed of a cancer cell. It's the disease, not the cure. If suddenly all that were done, then we could gradually move to a long-term human population of something like maybe 1 billion people, which would provide, you could have wilderness for the people who wanted to be in wilderness. You could have big cities for the people who want to go to fine restaurants and art museums. And you could design a world in which humanity would last for millions of years rather than for a couple more decades. I don't mean to say I'm certain that humanity itself will become extinct in the next few decades, but I'm reasonably certain that the collapse, which is already underway, will persist to the point where nobody will have the kind of life we would like to have in a few decades. After all, Europe is burning down, the US is burning down. We have more and more fascist governments. Fascism is a real threat in the next few years. in the United States, and we know what happens in fascist societies. So the answer is no, I don't have any real hope because I'm a realist. I'm after all, I'm facing the prospect of checking out of this mess in the very near future. That isn't a pleasant prospect. I don't spend my time hoping that I will live to be an infinite number of years old, particularly because the prospect doesn't look all that attractive.
Well, that's not mincing words, and that is sober, and yet you still endeavor. So let me just ask about this, because you're the president of the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere. It's called the MAHB, aka the MAHB at Stanford. What is that initiative about?
Well, the basic idea, which was started originally by Ann and me, and then Donald Kennedy, who was president of Stanford about that time. The idea was there had been around the turn of the century, a millennium assessment a millennium ecosystem assessment, looking at what was happening to our life support systems, which was no surprise to anybody who'd been studying them for 50 years. They were going down the drain. Colleagues and I recently wrote a paper for the Royal Society and published it, called which had, I think, in the title, Circling the Drain, because that's what we're doing. And remind me of your question.
Wait, you're the MAHB. What's it on?
Oh, yeah, the MAHB. Yeah. The idea was that lots and lots of people were individually concerned with the state of the world, but usually on one issue, that is women's rights, gun control, too many toxic substances, the wrong kind of industrial farming. People were doing all sorts of things, hoping to change it, but they were not looking at or broadcasting the existential threats and not getting civil society united on these issues. In other words, I think every reasonable human being ought to be a crusader for women's rights. But when we worked hard on the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States, many women wouldn't vote for it. So we basically were taking a grassroots approach, trying to organize, succeeding in many ways, to organize people in civil society to always discuss what the big problems are and do something about them when you're dealing with the local problem you're working on. You're working to prevent toxic chemicals from being dumped in the local park. That's important, but you can do that till you're blue in the face if you don't do something about women's rights, overpopulation, overconsumption in general. The local park is going to disappear sooner or later anyway. And so the MAHB's goal has been, and in a minor way, it's been quite successful, to try and organize civil society to get smarter about how it tackles the existential problems.
And you still believe that empathy plays a role in that?
Empathy plays a role in everything. You cannot be a Homo sapiens if you're not empathetic. In other words, first of all, traditionally, we are a small group animal, and we lived in groups for most of our history of somewhere between 50 and 150 people, sometimes even smaller. And you can't survive, say, on the African savanna. Suppose you're one of our ancestors, an Australopithecus. You don't have sharp teeth, you don't have fangs, you don't have claws. What you have is a group to cooperate with. And you can't cooperate with a group unless you can put yourself in the position of other members of the group, which reasonable people always do all the time. You can't avoid it. If you're going to work with people, you have to understand their viewpoint. You have to put yourself in their shoes. Sympathy is something you feel about somebody's situation. Empathy is putting yourself in their shoes, trying to understand them, trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And you can't avoid it with people you know well, or even with your pseudo-kin. And pseudo-kin are people you see all the time and begin to relate to, but have no impact on at all. And I am very empathetic, I know, because I'm easily sucked in by pseudo-kin. Who are pseudo-kin? They're the characters in your favorite soap opera. They're the hero in the novel that you read, where you can't avoid when something bad happens to them. You wish it hadn't. You think of what they should have done. You're sorry for their disasters and so on. We are sucked in all the time because of our tendency to be empathetic. And we could not have survived to be at this stage if we hadn't been highly empathetic to begin with. Newborn infants are empathetic and react to, I believe there's a study that showed that in something like 45 minutes, newborns try and imitate their caregiver, put themselves in the caregiver's position. They do it by photographing the newborn watching a caregiver and having facial expressions that mimic those of the caregiver. But for a whole series of reasons, our basic empathy has not been well directed in spreading to, unfortunately, a family not of 50 to 150 people, but somewhere around 8 billion. A small group animal is now trying to live in gigantic groups, and I hate to say it, doing a lousy job of it.
Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. I want to follow up with that by asking a question. Just this morning, I came across a new term that caught my attention called internalized capitalism. So this made me think of something else you wrote in Humanity on a Tightrope, which we will include all your books listed in the description below. But that book is worth a read. And so let me read again a little quote. If over-consuming societies could reshape their economies away from the produce more, consume more ethic, then work weeks could be shorter, vacation times longer, and learning opportunities more abundant. There would be more time available for adults to enjoy friends, to mix with their kids, and to stop and smell the flowers. That would be a form of more for everyone. That could be sustainable and coexist with democracy. That many countries in Europe do so much better in this respect than the United States suggests that this is far from impossible. So what this suggests to me is that making dramatic changes could help thwart not only devastating consequences for millions of people, but could also be of great benefit to each and every one of us. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's absolutely true today, although because we've gone another 15 years down the drain, the odds of ever achieving it are something I mean, worse really than the additional 15 years has been the shift in the United States, but in many other countries too, to psychopaths leading the country like Donald Trump and moving in every possible direction to avoid that. You know, the United States has the highest, I believe, in the world per capita expense for medical care, and our medical care is lousy. We have great universities, but the one that I worked at most, Stanford, only really now has one function, and that is grubbing for money. It doesn't do anything at all for the society. It shows no leadership. There is not now a university president in the United States who is a public intellectual, although 50 years ago, that was not the case. In fact, Don Kennedy, who I mentioned to help with the MAHB, was, I think, the last public intellectual university president in the country. You do not learn about existential risks at Stanford unless you take a lot of special courses. You're not even trained in very simple things as a freshman on things that you should have learned in middle school, like what are ecosystem services, what controls fertility rates, on and on and on. So the state of the education system is ghastly. And I had hoped, as many people had, that the web and electronics would make education simpler, but unfortunately, which I did not foresee, is that there's actually more crap on the web than genuine information. And yeah, I'm in a special situation. I know enough about the world so that I can sort through the stuff on the web. But as you clearly see from the way, for instance, many Americans vote against their own interests and don't know what they're doing, that we have not got the culture gap solved, that everybody should know fundamental things. Excuse me, when I'm talking about this stuff, I always have to drink a little gin. It clears my throat and mind. Go ahead. You were going to ask me something.
I was just going to follow up by asking, what do you point your finger to? Like, it's gone from bad to worse over your lifetime. Why? What do you think is the root cause of all of this, that we're not paying enough attention and reacting in a way that makes more sense for humanity's survival?
Well, we can go all the way back and look at various mistakes. Maybe the first one was practicing agriculture. Then there was industrialization and financialization. In other words, it's fairly recent that all value has been in terms of money. And when you financialize everything, then anything that will get you more money is thought of as being good. I mean, look, we have a mob of, I'm trying to think of a polite word, of people who are billionaires. And you ask yourself, what in hell can a billionaire get from spending money anymore? And it's a stunning issue. There's one jerk who wants to occupy all the planets with human beings. This shows that somebody who's a billionaire can't do arithmetic. For example, if we were going to occupy Mars at the kind of growth rates that I wrote about back when the population bomb was written, if you could send people to Mars in commercial airliners with the round trip being something like a month, it would take a very short time to fill Mars to the same density as Earth. Mars is smaller. And of course, Mars is not habitable. And making Mars habitable is a small project, apparently, that has escaped the notice of the jerk who wants to occupy the universe. And yet, again, because people have a lot of money, they are given power, they are given respect. In other words, instead of being laughed off the planet, this jerk is given lots of news time. There's a guy named Peter Thiel who thinks that we should become a dictatorship. He's got a lot of money and a lot of power and very little knowledge. And that's a huge problem. That's the culture gap. Here we are, both of us on computers. Neither of us can even describe, at least I think you can't, how the computer actually works, where the parts were got, how what minerals and so on had to be refined to make it, how it's put together. There are people who know that, but those same people don't know what an ecosystem service is. We have not gotten an education system that explains to people how the world works, both socially and biophysically. And we have two complex, what are called complex adaptive systems that are lots of small units interacting with each other with different goals. The biophysical system in which we are embedded and part of, and the social system. And we are not able to deal with them. We can predict certain things still, people who know how to do it, but you can't predict anything in detail. And I can give you an example. A complex adaptive system is the highway system with lots of cars on it, and each one has a goal, and they're all running basically as independently as they can. And you cannot predict when you get in your car and start driving how soon you'll get to your destination. One of the things you can predict is there's probably a fairly high chance of a traffic jam. And you get to the traffic jam and you run in it for a while, and then it ends.
Yeah.
Yet there was no nude person of the opposite sex on the curb or a big crash or something. You don't know why it stopped. You don't know why it started when it started. And that's the kind of system we're working with. We can predict that there's going to be lots of discontinuities, increasing numbers of them. That is, the system is going to fail in various ways more frequently, but predicting exactly what failure will be. I mean, for example, we have already in the United States a great increase in extreme weather events. We have an increase in the area in the West caused by fires. But if you live in the West like I do, I can't predict when one of those fires is going to sweep through Palo Alto and cremate me. Although I'll save money if it does. But
Okay, so you've been a vocal scientist on a mission for decades, and thank you for all that work. I would like to, okay, I know that you're 90 years old, right? So I wonder if you could take off your academic hat for a second and speak as a man. And you said not only a father and a grandfather and a great grandfather, right?
yeah.
Right. So if you'll indulge the frame of you being in the twilight of your life, I wonder if you could offer any pearls of wisdom about the way we can live our lives on an individual level that might be helpful and more empathic.
Well, first of all, my advice to young people going for careers has always been the same. Do something that you love. If your work is a pain in the ass, get some other work. In other words, if you're not enjoying what you do for a living, train yourself to do something that you really like. So people think I'm a workaholic because I would go to Costa Rica and 40 days in a row go out at the crack of dawn and census bird populations. They think I'm working. I'm playing there. I love birding. I love working with butterflies and so on and so forth. So that's the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice, I think on really important things, because science is a huge interest of mine, but so is sex. And I think you should learn all about sex, have safe sex, enjoy sex. It was not designed just for reproduction. What we call sex is a big part of social life and empathy, and is something that is badly handled in our society in every way. So when you're really depressed, find your partner and have some sex, and it'll cheer you up. And beyond that, drink good wine if you can afford it. But we should all be able to drink good wine without having to afford it. It's a crop that can be grown on relatively lousy soil. And if we had a population of only 1 billion people, most everybody could enjoy good wine. A little bit of brain modification can't hurt.
Not what I was expecting as advice, but I love it. And so will my students, especially if I make this assigned listening. You have been so delightful. I have treasured this conversation, and I'm so happy that you are the 100th guest of the podcast and the show. A final question, which I love to ask my guests, which is, can you think of a time in your life or a story from your life where you were on the receiving end of empathy, and what I call purposeful empathy? So being empathic, really on purpose, and what that meant for you.
Oh, yeah. I would immediately say that from the point of my career, in two things. First of all, my mother, who died at 99, my father died at 46, so you take your choice. But my mother was an intellectual when women weren't intellectuals. She got a college. She wouldn't marry my father till she got a college degree. They weren't for money, but she got fellowships and so on. And she gave me a very explicit and modern education in sex and in how you treat other people. And one of her major things was that it is absolutely critical that you treat other people well. To give you an example, which you may not want to tell your students, when I was 8 or 9, she explained menstruation to me. And she then said, the girls in your class are going to start menstruating, and one or more of them may have accidents, and you should not let anybody tease them about it, and explain and treat them well. Make sure that they feel better about it. So at the personal level, there was an example of me getting a lot of empathy. And professionally, I had 2 professors who I remained friends with. My major professor for our entire lives. He died at 95, maybe 6, 7 years ago. But we worked together. We actually published a paper when he was, I think, 90 and I was 83 or something like that. And he was very frank and always gave me honest answers to things and always made me feel good about being a scientist. And the second one was the same way. And so I had the luck to have 2 mentors who really cared about me and taught me a lot about how to deal with students, as I'm sure you know. I will only tell one example of empathy that I like to repeat, particularly to teachers. When I went to be a graduate student at the University of Kansas in the Department of Entomology, that is studying insects, Charles Michener was my major professor that I was just describing. But they had cutthroat seminars where the graduate students tried to make each other look bad and ask difficult questions and so on. And there was a lecture by an idiot, I shouldn't give my judgment, by another graduate student on tobacco mosaic virus and how it moved from cell to cell in the tobacco. And I couldn't follow. He was not describing it in a way that I could understand. And I finally said, Bob, I just don't get how you got there from A to B. And the speaker said, Paul, that's because you're a moron. If you were more intelligent, you would understand it. And Michener was sitting behind me, my major professor and his major professor, and he said, I don't understand it either. Now, I don't know I never learned whether Mitch actually understood it, but what he did was so empathic that I've always remembered it.
That's all of that is a beautiful story. I mean, I love your mom teaching you that at a young age. And I think why I like asking this question of my guests is that time and again, whatever story they end up sharing, it's a reminder to me every time I do these interviews that empathy is so accessible to us and it has such a positive impact, not only for the person who receives the empathy, but I think also for the person who extends the empathy. And so thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure. It's been very nice sharing a little time with you.
Same. And so I'll just end on a final quote from you, Paul, which is, our human families have been extending and expanding empathy for thousands of years. For the final step to save civilization, everyone must strive to transform that tide into a tidal wave. Thank you. And to all of our listeners and all of our viewers who have been with us for the 100th episode, we're now in 101 next. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free of your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.ca and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.